Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day or night or whenever you're watching this. I mentioned in my last video that I have celiac disease, and I actually thought it would be a super interesting and hopefully informative video to kind of sit down and share my story with it, how I was diagnosed, kind of how I deal with it on a day-to-day basis. I think it's something crazy like 1 in 100 people have celiac, or either that or like 10% of the population, some crazy statistic. And then on top of that, a lot of people actually are intolerant to gluten. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of share my story and yeah, so let's begin. I made a cup of tea because I felt like this was going to be a long video. I rarely ever talk about this, so it's kind of interesting to sit down and actually like purge my thoughts on all of this. But yeah, lucky you guys, you get to hear them. So I was actually about 10 years old when I was diagnosed. This was about 11 years ago. And honestly, before that, I had never heard of gluten. I didn't even know what it was. I don't think many 10-year-olds do. Maybe now they do. Yeah, I had never heard of it, didn't ever hear of celiac. What actually happened was my oldest sister was diagnosed with celiac after having a lot of symptoms that are associated with celiac. Some doctor finally said, "Hey, have you been tested?" after she'd been tested for a whole bunch of other things, and it turns out through the blood test and then an endoscopy, she was diagnosed with celiac. And since it is genetic, it's an autoimmune disease, my mom and dad thought it would be a great idea for our whole family to get tested. And from those tests, we found out that I had it, my oldest sister had it, my mom has it, and actually my middle sister was recently diagnosed with a gluten intolerance. So we're kind of like a gluten-free family. The only one who was saved was my dad. He can eat anything, and he is one lucky man. So like I said, after we found out that my oldest sister had it, we all got tested. I actually did the blood test, and that came back surprisingly negative, but then they thought just to be safe, because I had some trace markings of something, they should do an endoscopy, which is when they actually put a camera right down your throat into your small intestine, which is where celiac actually manifests. And they see if there's any scarring. They can actually see like marks on your small intestine if you have this sort of, I don't want to call it an intolerance because it's not really an intolerance, it's an actual disease, but if you have celiac, you're able to see the markings. And they actually started to see small amounts of scarring on my small intestine, so they're like, nope, no more gluten for you. But I was 10 at the time, and so my mom and sister, they had been diagnosed a few months before, and I had watched them struggle with it so much. Like when we went on a family vacation, we were actually in Italy, and just no one understood what they were talking about. This was 10 years ago, like I said. Everyone was like, gluten, what do you mean? Like, it only has a little bit of breadcrumbs. And they're like, no, we can't do anything. And my parents actually found out the results of my test while we were away in Italy. And so they knew I would be super upset if I found out I had it, because I was a kid that loved pasta, loved pizza, loved crackers, loved bread, sourdough bread. Oh, I can still taste it. And so they actually were really sweet and they waited until we got back from vacation to tell me. And I still remember my mom telling me, and like tears welling in my eye. This is my 10-year-old self, like, what do you mean I can't eat pizza anymore? Like, this is awful. And 10 years ago, there really wasn't a ton of substitutes for people who had celiac. So right now, you know, you can go to the store and you can get gluten-free donuts, you can get gluten-free pizza, but back then there was just this awful purple rice bread, which I still remember. I don't know if any of you have had this before. It was like eating glue. Like you would put this massive, thick, dense piece of purple rice bread. I wish I had like a picture I could insert. It was so horrific. I remember bringing it to the lunch table in 5th grade and everyone being like, what are you eating? And lucky for me, I was at an age where my parents could sit me down and really talk to me about, you know, what was okay to eat, what wasn't okay to eat. So I always knew kind of the boundaries, and like I couldn't eat my friends' cookies even if they wanted to trade me for my brownie that was gluten-free or something like that. So lucky for me, I was relatively young when I was diagnosed, and I didn't really have any of the typical symptoms of celiac, which can be a whole host of things. But lucky for me, I was like growing to my full potential. One of the major side effects of celiac is being malnourished, because basically your small intestine attacks gluten as if it was like a pathogen or something. It evokes an immune response, and that immune response actually damages your small intestine, and these things called villi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Did like a 5th grade project on this, so that's why I know. But it actually damages these villi, which are what take all the nutrients from the food that we eat. So if they're damaged, then you won't grow to your full potential, or it can affect your growth rate. Putting on weight can be really difficult. But like I said, lucky for me, I didn't really have any of the typical symptoms. So I just cut out gluten, and that sounds relatively easy. It definitely wasn't back then, and now I don't think it's particularly easy. We have a culture that like consumes a lot of things with gluten. But yeah, I think for me, the biggest challenge was not actually eating gluten-free, but like feeling confident in eating gluten-free. Because when I was at home, my mom was great, and she would make us like beautiful meals that I never had to worry about, obviously because she had celiac and her kids had celiac. So that is how we were going to start preparing meals. But when you actually go out to a restaurant, you have to be a lot more careful, and people are careful to varying degrees. Like for instance, for me, cross-contamination isn't a massive deal. Sometimes I feel it in terms of like intestinal distress afterwards, but it's nothing that like I really stress about. Whereas for my older sister, who had a lot more symptoms, cross-contamination is very serious to her. So if there was, a pizza oven, it's not okay for her gluten-free pizza to be cooked in the same oven as a gluten pizza. But anyway, this is such a rambly video, so I feel like I'm gonna get off track a million times. But anyway, what I mean by confidence in a gluten-free diet is kind of knowing what to ask for, and then on top of that, being confident in what you're asking for, because a lot of times I've experienced people who are really skeptical when you go to a restaurant and you say like, hey, can I have this, without the bread, or can I have this but no croutons or something. People kind of wave it off as like, oh, you're either just doing kind of like a diet or a fad, and it's not something super serious. But definitely for people with celiac and for people with gluten intolerances, it's something that should be taken seriously. And I always really appreciate when wait staff at restaurants are super accommodating and always check in. I've definitely found that if I like preface the conversation with, I have celiac disease, can I not have bread on this? They're a lot more understanding than if I just ask for no bread. Not that I'm saying that that's right, but that's something in my experience that has been really helpful. There's definitely been a few times where I've asked for no bread on something, and I remember I think I was like 13. So this is like, peak awkward stage. You're in middle school, you're already uncomfortable. And I remember I went out to lunch with my friends and I got a burger. And I've always been kind of like a lanky kid. And I got a burger and I said, hey, can I have the burger, but can I have no bun on that, please? And the waitress looked at me and she was like, honey, I'm gonna put a bun on that for you. And I had never experienced anything like that before, but it was this weird moment of all of a sudden I started to feel really self-conscious, like people were judging me for not having bread on something when like it wasn't something I could help. Like it's a health condition, like I can't do anything about it. And there's been other experiences like that, and I think that really comes from like a lack of understanding or not, knowing maybe that like this is an issue for people. And so that's kind of partly why I wanted to do this video, because I think at least kind of in like the town that I grew up in, there's now like a stigma around being gluten-free, which is kind of like, hoity-toity, like no gluten. But for some of us, like we really don't have a choice. And for people who are doing it, for other reasons, there are great health benefits to it. So I don't think anyone should judge anyone else's dietary needs. So definitely as the years have gone on, it's gotten a lot easier, not only because I'm really familiar with what I can eat and what I can't eat, what I can't eat and what I can eat, but also just because it's become more popular. So like I said, there's a positive and a negative side to kind of it becoming more popular. Positive means that like there's a massive market for it and there's a ton more options for me at the grocery store. But then the negative side is that some people don't take it as seriously because they don't understand that like for people in my position, it's really important that there's no like trace gluten, anything like that, whereas maybe someone who's doing it as more of like something to maybe lose weight or reduce inflammation or something, you know, if there's like a breadcrumb or two, it might not affect them the same way. So pluses and negatives to that. I definitely think that although there are a lot of alternatives, I definitely don't feel as well when I'm eating mostly alternative food. What I mean by that is like eating a gluten-free donut doesn't make me feel great. I definitely notice that I feel my best when I'm just eating like a naturally gluten-free diet. So a lot of fruits, a lot of veggies. Protein is super important for me. I'm like borderline anemic, which is kind of like a side effect of celiac disease. So getting a lot of iron, especially in red meat, spinach is super important. I pretty much have eggs every single morning. I definitely commend people who can do the vegan lifestyle. For me personally, it doesn't work with my dietary restrictions already. I'm also allergic to nuts. Wow, this is just like such a sad video. I'm also allergic to nuts. So, you know, that would be kind of an alternative food source. And I try not to have too much soy because I was recently diagnosed with Hashimoto's disease as well, which is an autoimmune disease that tends to go with celiac actually, and it has to do with your thyroid. And soy has like a big effect on that. So I'm trying now to reduce my soy intake. So I couldn't really do tofu. And anyway, finding a protein source besides meat and eggs would be challenging. And I mean, if you guys know of anything like an alternative that doesn't contain nuts or soy, I'd love to hear about it. So definitely leave me a comment down below. I still get the occasional flare-up of celiac sometimes. I'll go out to a restaurant and there'll be soy sauce in something and I don't think about how not all soy sauce is gluten-free, and so I order it and then I kind of feel it the next day. I definitely get a lot of bloating whenever I have gluten, and that's definitely not fun. And then along with that comes some like uncomfortable intestinal distress, we can just call it. But yeah, I mean, I feel really fortunate. I know that people who are diagnosed later or people who just have super severe symptoms, it can be really tough, and it can be like a lifelong battle trying to reverse them. So for me, I know the things that have been super helpful is just trying to gather as much information as possible on what I can do to feel my best and what new foods there are. Safeway actually has developed a really great gluten-free section, but typically if I can, my preference is to shop at Whole Foods, although it's really pricey. It's just really easy to go in there and feel like everything's labeled, everything's really accessible. But yeah, Safeway has a really great section. The one grocery store that I struggle with to buy gluten-free products that aren't naturally gluten-free is Trader Joe's. And I think that's just because a lot of their products are frozen. And so most of it is just kind of like pizzas, stuff like that. But yeah, I don't feel like they have the greatest gluten-free section. I'm definitely someone who prefers to look at a menu before I go to a restaurant, which does make going out a tiny bit difficult. But I'm lucky that I'm also surrounded by people who are really understanding of like my dietary needs and will always give me a heads up if we're going to try somewhere new so that I can look ahead of time at the menu and make sure there's something for me. And most of the time there is something, and if there's not, I can usually go and be that really high maintenance person who asks for a really specific thing that's not on the menu, like a piece of grilled chicken and sauteed spinach, because usually every restaurant has that. So if I could give anyone who's just being diagnosed with celiac or really any dietary concern a piece of advice, it's honestly just to be confident in it and know that it's really not that big of an inconvenience. And I think that's what I've learned over the years, is that especially when you're going out or say you're going over to a friend's house or something, people are more understanding than we give them credit for. And I think for me, my assumption is that like I'm being really inconvenient or really high maintenance to them, but for them, it's just like being accommodating and being a good human and trying to help someone out who obviously has some like restrictions or dietary needs. So I feel like there wasn't like a really clear point to this video, but it was kind of fun to just sit down and share all this with you guys. And I hope that you brought like a snack or something, because I feel like this turned into a really long video, so I'm sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. But yeah, if you made it all the way to the end, then congratulations, you are a super subscriber or super watcher if you're not a subscriber already, but you should hit the button down below if you want to. And yeah, it was fun just talking with you guys. If you have any more questions about celiac or Hashimoto's disease or what are my favorite snacks or anything like that, I know I got a comment on the last video that you wanted to hear about my favorite snacks, so maybe that'll be coming. But definitely leave me a comment down below. That way I know whether you guys like this video or not. And thank you so much for watching. I post weekly videos on Friday, and make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!